welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is really concerned about the citizens of the future, of India's future. He's described his work, his organization's work, as something that is concerned about children, that worries about children. He's a philosopher of education and a towering influence on what children will study. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Krishna Kumar, who heads the NCERT. I want to get the sort of the routine stuff out of the way, and because there's a lot of sort of discussion and discourse and rewriting history and what what's going to happen each time a government changes. Are we going to go and rework that? And I say get that out of the way because I know that your passions and concerns go far beyond that one issue that seems to be dominating discourse about NCERT at this time. What is the real challenge that you face on this issue of rewriting history? There was, the BJP government had its interpretation, had its take on history, and wanted to use history to manage perceptions, to manage India's future, the sort of whole discourse around it. You now seem to be struggling, liberal opinion seems to be struggling with the left, and so it goes on. What is the real challenge that you confront?
I think history need not be distinguished from other subjects. The challenge is the same in science or in mathematics. And the challenge is to let the child discover something. In science, you let the child verify by letting the child carry out an experiment or observe something with his or her own eyes. The historian normally acts like a magician. The historian tells you that, let's say, Gandhiji withdrew his movement because of an incident in Chauri Chaura. The historian doesn't normally tell the child, how does he know? Now, the challenge is the same. Let the child be a partner so that you share with the child on an illustrative basis what is the evidence on the basis of which you are saying X happened and Y didn't. Are there debates? Is there uncertainty? Share it with the child so that the child develops an enduring interest in the past, a curiosity about the past, and gradually we then build a society which doesn't live in the past, rather it lives with the past. So the past is there, it's over, and all we can do is to be respectful to it, be curious about it.
This sounds like sort of perfect, rational common sense. Why isn't it happening? Why are we sort of continuing this debate, this dialogue, this struggle with making what seems so rational, logical, and perfectly acceptable? Why is this becoming such a major issue?
If I were asked, I would have said, we haven't really looked at children's education professionally. And that is the heart of the problem. Issue of quality, issue of professionalism and rigor in working for children, working with children, is the same across the board, whether you are looking at how we run our kindergartens in cramped rooms and in spaces where you won't like to leave cattle. We run kindergartens, we run schools in such spaces. It's the same issue. When you deal with different subjects, if you don't deal with the epistemology of those subjects from the child's point of view, then you run into trouble.
That seems to me to be the key, and I think that we seem to be very sort of obsessed with the supply push of sort of textbooks and what's that going to teach the children, and this relates to that that whole notion of teaching values and teaching sort of moral education and having a class for moral education where you go out and teach children through curricula and instruction that be moral and somehow that will happen. Learning is a transformative process. It's a lot more subtle than the supply push of information that you feel children should accumulate and should know. There seems to be a sort of a fundamental mindset that you're up against, because I've been privileged to read some of your writings on the philosophy and approaches to education, and I think sort of the great celebration of your vision of education is for the child to celebrate this process of learning. What are you up against?
I think we are looking at a system which is ossified and rigid, where there's a very long backlog of reforms, and you're looking at layers upon layers of public opinion, opinion which has never been inquired into or engaged with. So you end up with issues which date back to, let's say, 1870s, some issues which Pule dealt with in his submission to Hunter Commission in 1884, I'm sorry. They are the same virtually, issues of school calendar or how teachers treat children. Some of these issues were underlined by philosophers like Vivekanand, later on by Tagore, later on by Gandhiji, and it has become a kind of a dateless diary. So you are up against really a system which has been crying aloud for reforms. Somewhere we have to begin, and I'm glad that the National Council today is hoping to sow a seed of certain reforms, some of which have been around, but it's a question of sustained will on the part of the state to
So why don't
carry
you
out.
sort of encapsulate for us, very briefly, your vision, your articulation of the goal of education, its methodology. What is it that you would strive, what is it that you dream to see for these young people, these children that you feel passionately about and care so deeply about?
Well, we would like to see children treated as children in our schools to begin with, which would mean that I would like to see schools where there is no room for violence against children, where there is opportunity to feel relaxed. Learning requires that you are relaxed, then alone can you enjoy something. Which takes us to the question of very heavy, rather irrationally conceptualized syllabi, very bulky, stodgy textbooks, virtually nothing to touch or manipulate in a very denuded environment, and learning not going beyond the textbook in most cases. In our current national curriculum framework process, which is being led by Professor Yashpal, we are talking about textbooks being treated as a window. The window shouldn't attract attention to itself, rather should show you what lies beyond. There is a tree out there, feel it. There are birds, listen to them. Our system, focuses on what's the name of this bird. Now it doesn't matter. So long as you notice how it flies, how its flight is different from some other bird's flight. We just spend too long with children on, pressing down facts and information on them. So I would like to imagine a school which is relatively small, which has enough teachers, enough equipment to touch and play around with, which has room for art, which has a place for our heritage crafts, and which has a land which Malis are not looking after, like in our posh schools. The gardens look so perfect, you feel you have entered a 5-star hotel, where the place looks messy. That's a sign that children are active here, where children can grow plants, where they can improvise things around. That's the image of a school where you would imagine learning is a daily reality, and art is not for VIPs, and singing is not for welcoming, important people. The idea that ordinary things matter. The child celebrates ordinary life, and the child's life becomes worthwhile when it's connected. The idea of interconnectedness with a large number of things is how children's mind works. You don't have hard boundaries between disciplines. Now you're learning mathematics, stop learning geography now because the bell has rung. So we would like to see interdisciplinary kinds of linkages, and we would like to see linkages between the outside world and the classroom.
We'll come right back to that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Professor Krishna Kumar, who runs and is the director of the NCERT. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Professor Krishna Kumar. We were talking about sort of, the goal of education and what that might achieve and how and what that might be for children. But how can that be achieved? It depends so much on teachers, on the kinds of human beings teachers are, not just the skills that teachers might have. What you're talking about is really sort of a very utopian notion of the old Gurukul in some ways, where it's sort of an informal floor where the process of education is geared to the abilities, the needs of each individual student and their talents and skills and their personalities. How is this achievable as national policy that's structured and processed?
I must say I'm a great believer in teachers and our teachers. I don't have a sense of either disappointment with how the Indian teacher has fared, nor do I have a terrible, strong complaint. I visit villages all the time. One of my recent visits to East UP, I met a teacher called Prabha, who was looking after, believe me, 160 children with just one more teacher in that school. Now, I personally would have given up, but she had not only read some things during her B.Ed program, she was determined to carry on kindling hope in the children she was working with. She wasn't able to work with all the 80 children in her class, studying in different classes, and she wasn't particularly well trained. But the spirit with which she was carrying on, this was in district Bahraich that I met her, and I came back feeling just nothing but sheer humility, where I feel Aristotle would have refused to teach. She was carrying on. I think a large number of our rural teachers work very hard to put up that single child into the system where the child can move beyond to college and so on. There is a whole effort behind that. But we tend to anecdotally humiliate the teacher. We just anecdotally annihilate their dignity by saying they're lazy, they're absent all the time. The fact of the matter is that we don't have enough teachers. If today UP were to succeed in putting every child in the school, which is possible, it needs about 7 lakh more teachers. In all, it has about 3 lakhs today. Now, that is a picture of some of the North Indian states. In the South too, we need more teachers. Today we have an economy which is said to be growing, which is flourishing in fact. There's no reason why we can't have enough teachers. And if we had enough teachers paid reasonably well, then I don't think teachers would be a problem. Where our syllabus designing, our architecture of schools, our inputs into the school ethos, our ideas about early childhood, which is the formative period which we continue to neglect in our system, all of these, I have a feeling, would make a greater impact, should be cause of greater worry than the teacher who, despite the nation's neglect of his or her dignity, is carrying on. And in fact has carried on for more than 100 years in the most difficult conditions where you and I won't be able to function for a week. They carry on, and I think we ought to show much greater respect and confidence in the teacher.
You're a philosopher of education. You work hands-on. We're trying to make that a reality. What is the most difficult part of the hands-on dimension of your striving? I think that we have a sense of what that ideal situation for a child should be. But what is the greatest obstacle, difficulty? Surely it's not resources. It's not just about money. We get the sense that the education ministry isn't being able to effectively spend its money, and there's an education cess on tax. And I think that the community would certainly be willing to financially invest in financial terms. Why doesn't it happen?
Well, on a national scale, why reforms are proving so difficult to proceed with since the days of Modalia or Kothari Commission in the 60s, I think has something to do with resources. Today, maybe we will have more resources, which we badly need in appointment of teachers, in opening of new schools. But the more straight answer to your question would be, I think there is such a thing as widespread cynicism. When people look at education, they aggregate all the problems. They feel that unless everything changes, nothing can be done, which I feel is the good mark of a cynic. You start somewhere. If you have a child to look after, you start doing what you can. There is a widespread cynicism that very little can be done. You know, the middle classes or the upper middle classes have virtually seceded from the system. They are looking after their children in schools which they maintain. It's the children of the larger, particularly the rural masses, who pose a major challenge for the state. And since the middle class has almost withdrawn from state schools, there is no creative pressure on schools to function, which in 40 years ago, in the 50s or 60s, was there because India was a less divided society. Today, the divisiveness of our society actually is growing quite rapidly. And I think because of that, this cynicism seems to be widespread. You also have a systemic resistance, I would say rigidity. We are used to set ideas, and that's not true just in education. That's true in industry. If you look at how we manage our bus stands, you would feel the same thing. We feel that there's only one way to do things, and we are doing that. If it's not working, somebody is to blame. So we find somebody, and everybody finds a somebody. And that is part of the story of children's education.
There seems to be this sort of overwhelming emphasis on formal curriculum that we keep sort of debating almost infinitely, and then the books that will reflect that curriculum. And this is really just sort of an instrument for the more subtle processes of education that you have so eloquently written about and talked about. What kinds of structures, how can we formally begin to impact those more subtle elements that you're talking about? Can that be done through, I don't know what, through legislation, through laws, through investments? How do you actually get young people to sit down and look at the sunrise like they do in the Krishnamurti schools, or to listen to the birds, and as you sort of so eloquently described, it's not important to know which bird it is so long as you sort of internalize, you empathize, you intuit, you develop a relationship with the bird and observe the bird, and just pure observation. How do we begin to institutionalize things like that so that they begin to happen beyond places where Professor Krishna Kumars are there to sort of set an example?
I think some things are happening at the peripheries of the system. There are lots of institutions, you just mentioned one, where some of these ideas have been tried out and they have succeeded. I think our challenge is to mainstream such work. There's a great deal of innovative energy, has been there since Tagore's days. We just haven't treated that energy as being available to the system. So our goal ought to be to mainstream innovative effort, involve people who are doing innovative work in the mainstream system, and make the system less bureaucratic. So that such innovators feel at ease when they come to work for the government. Because our hope lies really with the government functioning in a more open way. And the National Council, I think, is a good place where that is something we are trying. In this National Curriculum Framework exercise, we involved hundreds of people from all kinds of regions, expertise, non-government organizations, creative people, in all areas. And that's the way. I think once our textbooks, our syllabi, our school designs show a difference because of this mainstreaming of innovative energy, I think there will be a great deal of energy unleashed in the system. As Professor Yashpal put it in his foreword, he said this adversity we see in the education system is self-imposed. There's so much creativity outside the school. We must ask ourselves, why don't we allow it to get in? Shubha Mudgal was our chairperson of the art focus group in the national framework. One question that her report, written by a large team of people in theatre, music, painting, etc., asks repeatedly is, how come the energy which art experience creates is treated as extracurricular? Why is it not curriculum? Now that's the same structural question in other respects. India is, a vibrant, robust society. If you look at its music, its films, its crafts, its politics, there is no dearth of energy. But why is the school a dull place? I think the answer is that the school has kept its windows and doors closed. And that is true of our state councils, ourselves. directorates of education need to listen to the voices in the peripheries. And today, luckily, we have a large number of such voices. Such institutions abound. And we only have to open our doors to them. Nothing will happen in a day. Education of a child is like a, teak tree, if I may say. It takes 16 years to mature. So if you're looking for immediate results, it won't happen. But if you sow the right seed, the possibility is that it will blossom, unfold, and others will notice that something has happened. In parts of the country, something is happening. But systemically, we have been very rigid. And that probably is the key to the question you asked.
Come right back in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Professor Krishna Kumar. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to continuing conversation with Professor Krishna Kumar of the NCERT. We were talking about planting the right seed. What is the seed that is unique to India, in a sense? You read about how many different societies are struggling with their own systems of education. They might be producing children or young adults who are economic assets, but are not really sort of growing and evolving in the holistic way that we might in India romanticize or hope for or aspire for our young people. So what is that unique quality that would be in sync with our heritage, our tradition, our aspiration as a nation, as a people, as a community?
I think our heritage has the great uniqueness of being one in which there is a multiplicity of voices, of ideas. Political scientists call it plurality. But that is where the key lies, that if you try to uniformize India, you will fall on your face. Because it's very unlikely that you will be able to destroy it, but you will get destroyed. The reform process will become meaningless. I think the idea of a flexible system which permits different kinds of regions to pursue ideas in their own styles, depending on what resources they bring to it, what are their priorities. I think that approach will work best, whether it's language, whether it's arts, whether it's to do with how local knowledge ought to be meshed with more universalistic forms of knowledge, etc. I think this plurality of approaches, which our policy luckily respects greatly, and says this plurality must be respected and put into a broad, loose framework of certain key values and certain methodologies of functioning. That's all we need. I feel that's what will help us to move forward. I quite agree with you that just about every system of education today is facing a crisis. And we have a chance to actually show something to the world by proceeding in our own way, where we don't uniformize, where we permit people to experiment with ideas. I think higher education in India today has the great task today of becoming an instrument of justice, because as you know, education has been itself an instrument of social exclusion for large sections of the peasantry, of the poorer people, girls, and so on. And if education has to be a source of hope for different sections of our society, there must be the possibility of proceeding from school to college and university with recognition of ability, of interest, rather than recognition of how much you can invest.
But instead of that notion of social justice, in the liberal sense that I would imagine that you suggest and imply, it's been interpreted in a very narrow sense of livelihood. And we're looking at schools that are including things like business studies and commerce, a sort of very mechanical, rote kind of subjects, instead of this wonderful large vision that you've been talking about. Is that an aspiration that you have, that some of these things that have come in the name of vocationalization are actually inhibiting and limiting the growth of the child? The curiosity, the joy of learning, of discovery is being lost because we're now learning how we have to put things in different columns and get our accounts right.
So I think we must recognize that work opportunities don't stifle education. Instead, work creates new forms of knowledge. It creates new forms of creativity. But when you define work in a very narrow sense, as being oriented towards knowledge of a certain skill, and nothing for ideas, nothing for mind, nothing to sustain your enthusiasm for life itself and respect for others, then you are really looking at a very sanitized form of work, and it ceases to be of educational value at that point. And that is, I think, where the problem with those interests which treat education as something where they can earn an extra buck by exploiting the innocent young or their parents, that's where their problem lies, that they don't see this wider sphere.
I don't know how many people watch this program, of parents of young children who carry heavy school bags and are in dismay, not just about school bags, but about the whole process of education. What concluding words of hope do you offer?
Well, from on behalf of the NCERT, I would say that our next round of textbooks will promise something to lighten the child's burden next April in the certain classes in which we will bring. But the other larger picture, I think, where we hope that we will promote an ethos where parents also can relax a little bit and let children grow. Gandhiji or the Buddha, if you look at the great philosophical line of thought in our country, it has been in favor of letting children learn from experience by relating to others. So if you are segregating your child from others, whether they are poorer or messier, or you are circumscribing your child's experiences by insisting that the child do only homework or attend coaching classes and nothing else, then you are really destroying the child's potential. And I feel that the National Council would be interested and committed to creating a positive ethos in which parents, teachers, policy makers take a second look at what we are doing and not sort of become part of any global madness to increasingly oppress children in the name of one crisis or another.
Well, I'm sure that these sort of thousands and millions of people coming to you and saying, all strength to you, and I don't know if there is an English equivalent of Aapke Muh Mein Ghee Shakkar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This has been a great pleasure, sir.
Thank you.